Of all the armies you can play on the tabletop, Necrons might be one of the most unique in terms of lore and gameplay. These ancient mechanical horrors, long bereft of mortal soul, march forth from their awakened tomb worlds to reclaim a galaxy they see as rightfully theirs, as infested with other sentient races that they view as little more than pests. With highly advanced technology and the powers of reanimation, the Necron overlords, led by the Silent King, are a problematic foe to face down. When you kill one, it rises over and over again. These two things make them dangerous not only in the lore, but on the tabletop as well. And today, I'm going to tell you all about the Necron. How did they become what they are today, and how can you build a fun, 2,000-ish point list of these indomitable androids? Let's get into the final video in my Warhammer for Beginners series. Welcome back to Starhammer. The Necrons, formerly known as the Necron tier, are one of, if not the oldest race in the Warhammer galaxy at this time. Hailing from the distant Halo Stars region of the galaxy, the Necron tier came into being billions of years before humans did, on a planet with limited protection from their star's harmful radiation. As such, their lives were incredibly short due to the radiation sickness that had seeped into their genetics over time, causing them cancers and all sorts of other bad stuff. Because they had such short lives, Necron tier society was built around their mortality. Their dynasties and families all planned for early deaths, and living was just kind of seen as this sort of inconvenient phase you had to get through. Eventually, the Necron tier achieved spaceflight and made ships from this living metal known as necrodermis, talk about why that's important in a second, to protect themselves as they settled on distant worlds. As time passed, the Necrons formed a sizable interstellar empire. While doing so, they encountered a race of sentients known as the Old Ones. These guys lived up to their name, as they had evolved long before the Necron tier, and in that time had become the literal masters of their universe. They were incredibly powerful psykers and were supremely technologically advanced. The Old Ones had achieved immortality and had eradicated all the things that blighted their lives. But when contact was made and negotiations began, the Old Ones refused to share these secrets with the desperate Necron tier. As the Necron tier were denied a cure for their ails, they fell into chaos. Dynasties decided to try and find their own way, and they all disagreed with how the Necron tier empire should proceed. The unification that was brought on by their shared interests in making their meager lives a little bit longer fell away, and a massive civil war broke out, now known as the War of Secession. The ruling body of the Necron tier, Triarch, began to understand that the only thing that would unify their dying race was another common enemy, and if it couldn't be their mortality, then it would be the Old Ones. This led Cesaric, the Silent King, to declare war on them and offered amnesty to any dynasty in open rebellion if they joined the war effort. The Necron tier, tempted by Bo's war and potentially learning the secrets of the Old Ones' immortality, once again unified, and then they began the war in heaven. I really want to emphasize this point here. Mortal minds cannot comprehend the devastation caused by this interstellar conflict. These are two highly advanced societies with total mastery over certain aspects of their universes that are just having an all-out slugfest. But despite the Necron tier being incredibly technologically advanced, even more so than the Old Ones in a lot of regards, they didn't have the webway or the mastery of the warp that the Old Ones possessed. So, little by little, the Necron tier holding the galaxy was obliterated, and they were beaten back to their homeworld in the Halo Stars region. The Old Ones figured that humiliation was a better punishment than annihilation, and they left the Necron tier to once again wither away in the face of their harsh star. This isolation did a number on the Necron tier. They began to grow bitter, xenophobic, and they devolved back into civil war. And it was in this darkest of hours, when the Necron tier were set to destroy themselves, that they made contact with beings they called Catan. The Catan were an interesting bunch. They were born at the same time as the universe itself, and as such, they were woven into its very fabric. Catan are basically energy vampires, and they typically feed on stars. It's theorized that they were drawn to the Necron tier because the Necron tier's hatred for the Old Ones acted like this lighthouse of energy that they just couldn't resist. It also could have happened purely by accident. Counts vary, so who really knows? Anywho, Catan means star god in the Necron tier lexicon, and indeed, these beings seem to be the very manifestation of the death gods the Necron tier religion focused on. They were primordial raw energy made reality. In that, the Necrons saw an opportunity. They saw a chance to get revenge on their old enemies and not make the same mistakes the Old Ones did in keeping their opponent alive. The Catan had problems of their own, however. Being of pure energy, the Catan couldn't perceive everything about the universe. All they knew was the stellar energies that they had been used to. So, the Necron tier, seeking the favor of these seemingly divine beings, crafted them bodies of necrodermis, that living metal I mentioned earlier, so that they could at last experience the sensations of the physical realm. For the Catan, this brought a sense of euphoria that they had never known in the eons of their existence. And what was particularly intoxicating, where the life energy is given off by their mortal allies. Enter Mephirdron, known among the Catan as the Deceiver. He gained an audience with the Silent King, Cesar, and wove a tale of suffering and loss his kind had experienced at the hands of the Old Ones. He told Cesar that the Old Ones had also beaten and humiliated his people, and that with the Necron tier at their side, they could both get the revenge they had been seeking for so long. He promised the Catan would help them defeat this common foe, and in exchange, the Catan would bestow upon the Necron tier the two things they had been robbed of for generations: unity and immortality. And this was a pretty tempting offer. Cesar debated this proposition for about a year with the other two members of the Triarch and the rest of the royal court. Throughout it all, Oricon, the royal astrologer, was the only one who spoke out against it entirely. He predicted that while this deal would bring about a new golden age for their people, they would pay this price with their very souls, and it would rob the Necron tier of who they really were. But the Necron tier were desperate. Their society was crumbling, and the Old Ones had left them to die on their despicable homeworld. And seeing no better options, Cesaric returned to the Catan and sealed the deal. This led the Necron tier to eventually start worshipping the Catan as god, and the Catan revealed how cruel they actually were and how they began feeding on the life forces of their mortal subjects. But before the war against the Old Ones could resume, the Catan had to fulfill their end of the bargain. Massive biofurnaces were constructed, and the Necron tier marched into them under the supervision of the Pharaons and the Catan. Within these structures, the Necron tier were stripped of flesh and soul, their bodies replaced with ones of necrodermis just like their gods. All the while, the Catan lurked overhead, devouring the souls of their subjects and indulging their eternal gluttony. For the most part, the Necron tier were robbed not just of their soul, but of their consciousness. Very little remained of the individual, just enough to animate the hulking robotic bodies they now possessed. And it was only when the Silent King himself emerged that he understood the scope of what he had wrought on his people. The Necron tier were no more, the undying Necrons now rising to take their place. Command protocols have been embedded within the bodies of Cesaric and the ruling nobility. But while the Necrons indeed had total unity and the immortality that was promised to them, most of their people were little more than mindless husks under the control of the Pharaons. This dismayed Cesaric, but the Necron tier also had a strength that they'd never had before. And with that renewed strength, and the Catan by their side, the two species marched against the Old Ones and reignited the terrible war in heaven. In the waning days of that war, when the Old Ones were defeated, Cesaric decided to turn the tables and led his people in rebellion against the Catan that had robbed them of everything that they had once been, just like Oricon said would happen. Using hyperphase cannons designed by the Cryptex, the Necrons used the very energy of the universe itself against their masters. These weapons were too powerful even for the mighty Catan, and it made short work of their targets. But, the Catan were literally spawns of the universe itself, made up of the very fabric of it, so they couldn't be destroyed outright. Instead, the Necrons used their god-killing weapons to break the Catan into thousands of little shards. This significantly reduced their power, and in their weakened state, the Catan shards were enslaved by the Necrons. When it was all said and done, he ordered the great weapons used against the Catan destroyed, and all knowledge of their construction erased. With the Old Ones wiped out and the Catan in chains, the Necrons were finally free. Yet with this victory, the Necrons paid a high price. Their worlds and populations were devastated. The Eldari, a race of psychic elves who fought alongside the Old Ones, were rapidly gaining influence in the galactic power vacuum. And in their current state, the Necrons wouldn't be able to stand a chance against them. So, Cesaric had the remaining Necron worlds transformed into massive tomb complexes, filled to the brim with stasis chambers. To allow his people a second chance at galactic domination, Cesaric ordered the Necrons to sleep in their tomb worlds for 60 million years, and to be ready to take up arms against whatever other alien civilizations they encountered when they awoke, in order to restore the Necrons to their former glory. When the last of these tomb worlds sealed its doors, Cesaric severed his command protocols that he held over the Necron race, and went off into the intergalactic medium as a form of self-exile for the horrors and the fate he had brought upon his beloved empire. But out in the dark space between galaxies, Cesaric encountered a totally unknowable foe of unfathomable intelligence and uncertain motives. A race of disgusting insectoid monsters driven by some distant hive mind, the Tyranids. Cesaric understood that if the Tyranids consumed all organic life, the Necrons wouldn't be able to fulfill their eventual goal of finding organic bodies to transfer their consciousness into, and become thinking and feeling beings once again. So, the Silent King returned to the galaxy to lead his awakening legions against the Tyranids and the other organic races once more. There is so much more depth to Necron lore than what I've said here. This is basically the SparkNotes version. So I highly encourage you to go read up and explore its facets for yourself if you got the time. So, when running Necrons on the tabletop, you have a ton of very delicious options. Unlike the Black Templars and Thousand Sons in my other 2 beginner videos, the Necrons have a codex. So we're going to check out their detachments first, and then get into some units. This video will be a little different from my other 2 in this series in that I'm not going to build a list around a specific detachment. Instead, I'm going to build one that can benefit a little from each one, and one that also seems the most fun, so that you have a good starting point to kick off of whenever you make your own. So for detachments, we've got Awakened Dynasty, Canoptek Court, Hypercrypt Legion, Obeisance Phalanx, and Annihilation Legion. Awakened Dynasty is what I would consider vanilla Necrons, and is the most well-rounded of your choices. Before the Codex dropped, this was the only one you could use, and it had a lot of good stuff in it. The basic idea is that this is extremely character focused. So with your detachment rule, any unit being led by a character gets to add 1 to their hit roll whenever they make an attack. Your stratagems and enhancements also follow that theme, letting you get additional buffs to character-led units, such as stealth that makes them harder to hit, or giving their leader a 6-inch aura that lets them extend their +1 hit to nearby friendlies. Stratagems can be used on just about anyone, but usually carry an extra benefit if targeting a character-led unit. Protocol of the Sudden Storm, for example, gives a unit's weapons the assault keyword, allowing you to advance and shoot. But if a character is leading that targeted unit, you can also re-roll your advance rolls and really maximize your movement and weapons range. Another feature is that you can fully utilize your reanimation protocols, allowing a unit to regain wounds or models after they've taken some hits with stratagems such as Protocol of the Undying Legions, which lets you activate your ability after a unit has lost models due to an attack. We've got a ton of ground to cover, so I won't go through all these stratagems because, quite frankly, there's a lot, but you get the idea. But what are reanimation protocols? Okay, so real quick, they're arguably one of the coolest features you have as a Necron army. Basically, in your command phase, each of your units that took damage activates the reanimation protocols. So you roll a d3 for each of those units, and that unit regains that many wounds. This is an essential thing to consider when it comes to units like Warriors and Immortals that only have 1 wound apiece, because reanimating up to 3 models, or more with the right war gear and circumstances, every turn can make Necron units incredibly hard to drive off a point. A lot of playing Necrons is understanding this mechanic. While many armies will play a little reserved, Necrons don't necessarily have to do that. A 20 model warrior block is going to be really hard to push off an objective. And with warriors getting a reroll on that reanimation d3, you are probably going to bring dudes back faster than your opponent can kill them. So be aggressive. Anywho, back to detachments. Destroyer Cult is focused on melee units, so Scorpax have played ones mostly. Necrons don't have a ton of melee options, but the ones they do are generally pretty solid. So if you're more of an up-close and personal type of player, this is the detachment for you. Your detachment rule allows you to reroll charge rolls, and if the charging unit is below half strength, add 1 to that charge roll as well. They have some cool enhancements, like Soulless Reaper that targets an enemy unit you're engaged with to trying to fall back. You roll a 3 up, and that unit can't fall back, allowing you to finish them off on your next turn or in the next fight phase. You can also use the stratagem Blood-Fueled Cruelty in conjunction with that enhancement as a backup plan. Say you fail your enhancement roll on that unit that falls back. You can use this stratagem on that unit that escaped and roll a d6 for it. On a 2 to 5, they suffer d3 mortal wounds, and on a 6, they take 3 mortal wounds. It might not be as damaging as keeping them in engagement range, but damage is damage, and mortals can't be saved against, normally. Canoptek Court is a little more complicated than the previous 2 detachments. It relies on objective control zones, and you get buffs to roll if a Canoptek or Cryptek unit makes an attack within those power matrix zones. A Canoptek Cryptek unit can always do a reroll of 1 to hit, but if they're within one of these zones, they can reroll the entire hit roll instead. Their enhancements and stratagems, of course, play into this as well. You can use the Dimensional Sanctum enhancement to give a unit Infiltrator, allowing them to deploy right in the midfield, and stratagems such as Solar Pulse allow your ranged attacks to ignore cover provided the firing unit is within range of an objective. If you like Overlord characters, then Obeisance Phalanx is the detachment for you. Like Awakened Dynasty, it focuses mainly on character-heavy lists, but specifically Overlords, Triarch, and Praetorian units. Your detachment rule allows you to add 1 to the wound roll of any unit being targeted by one of those types listed above, and the stratagems and enhancements reflect all this as well. And some of these are pretty damn nasty. The Honorable Combatant enhancement makes your opponent lose a CP if your Overlord's unit destroys an enemy. The stratagem Suffer No Rival gives Lichguard and Triarch units precision on their melee weapons, allowing you to make short work of enemy leaders. This detachment is really handy to run if you're going up against an army that relies heavily on character units, like Thousand Sons, so keep that in mind when you're thinking about what sort of list you want to make. The downside is that it does require extremely specific models, even more so than the Canoptek Court detachment. Finally, we've got my personal favorite, Hypercrypt Legion. If you're a Grey Knights player or have ever played against Grey Knights, this detachment rule might look very familiar to you. Essentially, depending on your battle size, you can take X units and pop them into strategic reserves at the end of your opponent's turn, provided those selected units aren't engaged in melee. After that, you can teleport these guys around the board by setting them up in your strategic reserve step of your movement phase. Enhancements like Osteoclave Fulcrum give a unit deep strike, and stratagems such as Cosmic Precision allow you to teleport within 3 inches of an enemy unit, as long as you aren't targeting a monster unit with that stratagem. Then it won't work. This detachment is all about being able to pop in and pop out of the battlefield as the situation warrants, and monoliths are a pretty sizable part of it. With the right strats, monoliths will allow you to zap units into the battlefield very quickly, allowing them to charge after they arrive, and can even recall damaged units and redeploy them safely outside the monolith. Now, I personally don't run monoliths, but I value this detachment for its unmatched mobility, which, if you've ever played against a zoomy army like Eldar, you know mobility can make or break a game pretty early on. Okay, so with detachments out of the way, let's get into a list. I'm building this list on Awakened Dynasty, and we'd be here all day if I made a list for each one of these damn detachments. So again, I decided to make a list with a little bit of everything, and just one that seemed like it could be a lot of fun. Regardless of what detachment you choose, remember to keep keywords in mind to ensure you're playing to detachment strengths when selecting your roster. Let's start with the Catan Shards of the Nightbringer and the Void Dragon. Coming in at 295 and 290 points respectively, these are two of the heaviest hitters that Necrons have to offer. Catan are criminally cheap in points for what they can do, and if you're not running at least one on any given list, you're wrong. Nightbringer is anti-everything. He does a disgusting amount of damage with both ranged and melee, and with his Drain Life ability, you have the chance to get free mortals at the end of the fight phase for all models within 6 inches of him, assuming there's anyone left standing to deal mortals too. The Void Dragon is going to be one of your big vehicle killers, but it can generally be anti-everything, much like the Nightbringer. His ranged attacks are great, with his spear getting anti-vehicle 2-up, which means that no matter how tough that tank is, you're wounding on 2-ups, and it does d6 plus 2 damage. His Voltaic Storm attack is also great for clearing out mobs, especially tougher ones like Space Marines. His Matter Absorption ability lets you target an enemy vehicle within 12 inches and roll a d6. R2-up, that vehicle suffers d3 mortal wounds, and the Void Dragon regains that many lost wounds. After the shooting is done, charge him in with melee and finish off those vehicles with the strike profile on his spear, and clear out any infantry hanging around in engagement range with his tail blades. Catan are pretty tanky. They all have the same base stats, and all of them have all incoming damage characteristics done to them. These guys are incredibly fun to use, and they can dish out an impressive amount of carnage on the board. I like to use them to tie up bigger units if I can. So last time I ran these guys, the Void Dragon went up against Mortarion, and they both duked it out the whole game. Round 5 rolled around, and they were still going ham on each other. Neither one died, and I still won the game, but it was one of the cooler showdowns I've ever experienced on the tabletop. I mean, just imagine a literal demigod and a piece of a primordial star god going at it, and what that would actually look like. I don't know, I just love visualizing all this when I'm playing. Moving on to the Chronomancer at 65 points. He's got an okay stat block, pretty ass attacks, but his abilities are pretty neat. Time Splitter Mantle makes opponents take a -1 to shoot when his unit is targeted, and Chronometron allows his unit to make a 5-inch movement after shooting, provided they aren't engaged. You can't charge after doing so, but it gives you a ton of extra mobility and can help you be aggressive in pushing objectives. I like to run this guy with Immortals equipped with Tesla Carbines because with that, the Immortals can shoot in advance since their weapons have the Assault keyword. So I'm getting 11 inches of movement at most on an advance, plus another 5 after they shoot with the Chronomancer. So run a blob of Immortals and go fucking nuts on pushing objectives. The Overlord is your next dude. At 85 points, he's got a decent stat block and some really good weapon options and damage dealing potential. His My Will Be Done ability lets you target his unit with a stratagem for 0 CP, similar to Space Marine captains, and Implacable Resilience subtracts 1 from any damage the Overlord might take. He can also take a Resurrection Orb as a War Gear option, allowing him to reanimate d6 wounds for his unit instead of d3 once per battle. Now, the Overlord goes well with either Warriors or Lich Guard. With Warriors, you'll get to re-roll that d6 Resurrection thanks to their ability, so you can keep them on a point potentially a lot longer. Alternatively, you can run them with Lich Guard and have a seriously impressive melee unit, as the Lich Guard are already pretty solid, and the Overlord has really good melee potential himself. The last character we have is the Technomancer at 85 points. As with a lot of Necron characters, his base stats are pretty mid, and his attacks are kinda shit, but his abilities are solid. Rites of Reanimation gives his unit a 5-up Feel No Pain, and Technomancer lets you reanimate d3 wounds on a unit within 6 inches of the Technomancer at the end of your movement phase. This guy is great to run with Canoptek Wraiths, which I'll get to later down in this list, so I'll explain more then. Moving on to battle line units. I'm running 2x10 Immortals with Tesla Carbines, and one 20-man Warrior Blob and one 10-man Warrior Blob. with default loadouts. Pretty straightforward here. Use your warrior blobs to really play defense on a point, and use your assault weapons on the immortals to be aggressive in pushing points. Immortals can reroll a wound roll of 1, or the whole roll if their target is within range of an objective marker, while warriors can reroll their reanimation and make sure you're able to bounce back any models you might lose defending a point. We're almost done, I promise. The Canoptek Doomstalker is this War of the Worlds looking motherfucker that will run you 145 points. This guy is great to keep in cover on your back objective because his main gun will reach pretty much anywhere on the board, and he gets a +1 to hit if he doesn't move. He doesn't have a ton of wounds, but he does have a decent stat block with a fat 4-up invuln save, and if anyone's brave enough to get too close, its ability Sentinel Construct allows you to hit on a 5-up instead of a 6-up when firing Overwatch. Not a lot to say here. He's got one hell of a main gun that can one-tap even heavier vehicles if you roll well enough, and there's really no reason to move it. So keep that home objective screened and go ham from a distance. Remember those wraiths I mentioned a minute ago? These guys will run you 125 points, and they've got a pretty solid stat block and solid damage dealing potential. And the wraith form ability rewards mobility by letting you roll for mortals on any unit they pass over after finishing a normal move. Yeah, I know they don't look like it, but they fly now.
They fly now?
But you run these guys with a Technomancer, and you have a very powerful defensive and offensive unit with the Technomancer's regen and Feel No Pain abilities. You've got a lot of versatility with Wraiths, and with their own impressive stats and invuln saves, they're going to be a real pain in the ass for anyone who has to go up against them. A squad of Deathmark should also be included in almost every Necron list, especially if you're going up against an army that relies heavily on character units. For just 60 points, a squad of 5 is a pretty cheap addition. They're basically immortals with fancy guns. These fancy guns allow them to target character units that are attached to bodyguards with their precision keyword. And their rifles don't mess around. These stats are pretty great, especially against Space Marines. Their Hyperphase Hunter's ability allows them, once per turn, to fire on an enemy unit that is deployed during your opponent's reinforcement step, provided that they're within 18 inches and an eligible target. And this isn't an Overwatch move either. This is considered a regular shooting action in terms of mechanics. That's pretty damn solid if you ask me. Now we've got Lich Guard coming in at 85 points. These guys are pretty tanky for Necron infantry models. Toughness 5, 2 wounds, peace, and 3-up save. As part of their war gear options, if you give them swords, you can give them shields, which also give them a 4-up invuln save. And these guys don't fuck around. Lich Guard with swords and shields can hit like a truck and have sticking power with their shield. With their ability of Guardian Protocols, provided they're being led by a noble keyword model, like an Overlord, if they're targeted by an attack that has greater strength than their toughness, the opponent subtracts 1 from their wound roll. Necrons don't have a lot of really good dedicated melee, so it's important that you have a unit like Lich Guard to counter other melee units. Speaking of other melee units, let's move on to Scorpack Destroyers. For 90 points, these guys are pretty cheap for what they can do. They're pretty beefy and fast, as you can see, and they can really put the smack down on enemy units. With Whirling Onslaught, each time a model in this unit makes a melee attack, you re-roll a hit roll of 1. If they made a charge move this turn, you can re-roll the whole hit roll instead. You can also burn a Plasma Sight token once per battle to give their attacks dead wounds, making these guys even more insane in melee. Being as how they're part of the Bloodthirsty Destroyer cults, kinda makes sense that they're really goddamn good at throwing hands. Last, maybe least, we've got Tomb Blades. Coming in at 75 points for 3, their stats are pretty on par for other Necron units, but they have a nice weapon selection that lets you mix and match to fit your own playstyle. They have 3 different war gear options, one that gives you a 3-up save but reduces movement to 6 inches, one that gives the stealth keyword which makes the enemy take a -1 to hit, or you can get Nebula Scopes which gives ranged weapons ignore cover. Now, I'd recommend giving them that 3-up save, because when you use their ability Evasion Engram, you get a free 6-inch normal move after making a ranged attack, provided you aren't already engaged. In that way, you offset that 6-inch reduction and keep your whole movement, and you get a 3-up save. It's kinda like having your cake and eating it too. They also get Scout 9, which gives them 9 inches of free movement before the game even starts. These guys are really great for hit and run tactics, but they tend to get blown away pretty quickly if they're not positioned properly. So use cover, plan ahead. These guys fly, so you can go over a lot of terrain regular units can't. Use your mobility, get in and out, and you'll come out on top. And that's all I've got. I know this was a long one, and if you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around. I really love Necrons. I really like the whole unstoppable androids, Skynet on crack vibes, and their models are easily some of the coolest ones around. Look at this Void Dragon and tell me that's not some of the dopest shit you've ever seen. As always, drop a like if you like it, a subscribe if you really liked it, and check the community tab for shitposts and shenanigans. I'll see y'all in the next one. Toodles.